Thank you very much for inviting me to tell you one of my stories and give you a little light relief after all these very serious papers that you've had to listen to. So let me tell you a story of what happened to me in May 1967. In May 1967, I was a regular in the Israeli army, a medical officer in the Israeli army, but I'd taken leave without pay in order to improve my orthopedic knowledge in the United Kingdom. And I was having a wonderful time. I was a senior registrar at Hammersmith Hospital, the postgraduate medical school of London. I was also attending great clinics at Great Portland Street and Royal National Orthopedic Hospital at the clinic branch in London at Great Portland Street, where many of the greats of that time were doing clinics. And I had just become Arthritis and Rheumatism Council Fellow, Research Fellow, which was to have been my sort of finishing period of my orthopedic training. One day, toward the middle of May in 1967, I get a telegram from the Israel embassy, from my army boss. You have to return immediately to Israel to join your unit. This was very awkward. I'd just been appointed your Arthritis and Rheumatism Council Fellow. And I went to see my boss, who was a man called Professor Kalnan, who was responsible for the research, the Medical Council for Research. And I said to him, look, what am I going to do? I'm terribly sorry. If I don't carry out this order, I'm going to be in real trouble. I'm going to be put in prison when I get back. I don't have any choice. So my best boss was quite understanding. He says, I'll give you a month. If you're not back in a month, you're fired. So I got on an Israeli Air Force plane, took me back to Israel. Few days later, about 10 days later after I got there, the war broke out. It was a very short war. And after the war, I managed to get back before the month period was over, and I was saved. I went back, and part of my duties there was that although I was now a research fellow, I still have to be on call for orthopedics in Hammersmith Hospital. So a few days after I got back, I had a request for a consultation in the Department of Hematology in Hammersmith Hospital. And of course I went there immediately to the patient. The patient turned out to be a certain Mr. Ibrahim, whose residence was in Cairo, who had visited a certain lady of infamous name several times, as a result of which he had developed gonorrhea. He went to see his doctor, and the doctor said, you have to have chloramphenicol treatment for a week. And he took the chloramphenicol, and within a few days, of course, he was feeling much better. But just to make sure that everything would be all right, he continued to take chloramphenicol for 3 months, as a result of which he developed aplastic anemia, was on the point of death. Now, the hematological department of Hammersmith Hospital at that time had a very good name, a very name of being some of the first, one of the first departments which was experimenting with bone marrow plant transplantation and so on. So the authorities in Egypt requested Hammersmith Hospital to admit Mr. Ibrahim, which they did. But aplastic anemia. He had a pain in the leg. And sure enough, he developed an osteomyelitis of the tibia. So we had a nice chat, and I said to him, look, because you have aplastic anemia and because you now have a fever and an infection, it's very dangerous to leave that infection the way it is at the moment. The least that we must do is we must debride all the dead tissue and also allow it to drain and not to be enclosed in the body, because that's going to be very dangerous for you. So I scheduled the operation on the next operating list. The next day, I get to about work, and I get a telephone call. Report immediately, please, to the head of the hospital. He needs to see you urgently. What does the head of the hospital want with a research fellow at the Arthritis and Rheumatism Council? Anyway, of course, I went immediately to see the head of the hospital. Come in. He says to me, Dr. Reis, I've just received a telephone conversation from the Consul General of Egypt, who tells me that he has received information that you are in the service of the Israel Secret Service, the Mossad, and there's a patient in the hospital who refuses to be operated by you, and such a thing cannot happen in Hammersmith Hospital. In Hammersmith Hospital, the patients are operated on by whom we decide, and not someone else. So I said to him, sir, this is a misunderstanding, sir. I have nothing to do with the Mossad of the Secret Service. So he says to me, well, let's go and meet the patient. Let's go to the patient together. And we went to see the patient and explained to him that there's nothing in this information, it's completely wrong. And what had happened was that one of the jokers, who was one of the residents of the hematological party, was a joker. And after I had given consultation to Mr. Ibrahim, he had told him the story of what had happened during the last month, that I had been there, that I suddenly disappeared, I suddenly went to Israel, and then I suddenly came back. And he was sure that there was something suspicious about that. Anyway, that's my story, how nearly my being an orthopedic surgeon created a serious international incident. Do I still have some time? Do I still have some time? I have. I want to tell you about an incident which happened to me. Actually, this is not an incident about orthopedic surgery, but it's slightly related, of which I'm very proud. I think it's maybe one of the proudest thing that I ever did in my life, that I'm really proud of it. I was living at the time in a kibbutz called Ein Harod, and I was at that time actually working as a general practitioner. It was a Sabbath, I remember, And I was having a bit of a good sleep in the morning. And suddenly there was a knock on the door, and there was a soldier standing outside. He told me, "Doctor, doctor, doctor, there's an emergency. Somebody has just fired a burst from his Uzi, and somebody is seriously injured down in the Nachal huts." The Nachal huts of the kibbutz were some huts where a group of soldiers were living there. For those of us not familiar with it, soldiers who were both worked on the land and also were training as infantry. So I immediately got up, and it was winter. I put on an anorak, took my medical bag with me, and as I was wearing, this is an important point, I didn't have time to get dressed. I realized it was emergency. I was wearing pajamas, and in those days one used to still wear nice pajamas which had a strap and so on, and keep you warm in the winter. And over that I just put an anorak and I went off. And I got down to the Nachal huts, true. One of the soldiers had been playing around with an Uzi and let off a burst of fire. And one of his compatriots or colleagues had a couple of bullet wounds. One of them was entered the abdomen, came out through the flank, and I had a look, but it wasn't bleeding, and it didn't seem any special. Very, very life-threatening condition, but he also had a fracture of the femur, an open fracture of the femur. So anyway, I gave him, they had the medical rucksack there. I was able to give him an injection of morphine and set up a drip and also put on a Thomas splint. In those days, we used to know how to use a Thomas splint. Something, unfortunately, that most of you young fellows have forgotten. It still is the best leg splint in the world. And we loaded this injured shoulder on sort of a little open truck, and I got in the back with him and the driver. There was the driver and me. And we drove to the Afula Hospital, Dr. Bo. We drove to the Afula Hospital, and at that time, there was only one brick building. The other buildings were sort of in huts. And the surgical department wasn't on the ground floor. The ground floor was the gynecology and midwifery department. The surgical department was on the first floor, one floor up. You had to go up the stairs. So when we got to the entrance of the building, I got hold. We'd put the injured person on the stretcher. I got hold of the stretcher, the hind part, and the driver took the front part. And we started walking up the stairs to the surgical department. And as I walked up the first steps, I realized that something terrible was happening. Something terrible was happening. I need to demonstrate, that's why I moved a bit. The pajama trousers, I could feel that the strap was loosening. And as I walked up the steps, they got looser and looser and looser. And as I got up the middle, suddenly they fell down. And I was trapped because the trousers were around my ankles and I couldn't move my legs. And I was holding the stretcher. The driver was up there holding the front of me. And why am I so proud of this particular situation? I didn't panic. I didn't panic. I managed to stretch the trousers enough to take them step by step up on top. But this was a very slow progress. Very slow progress. And as you realize, this was a sort of the constant, there was a lot of noise and so on. Lots of people began to look, and my private parts were totally exposed. Totally exposed. And I couldn't cover them anything because it took me time to get up the top of the stairs. Anyway, eventually we got up the top of the stairs. We managed to put the stretcher in the emergency room there. And I'm happy to report that this soldier, he recovered and everything was all right. But what happened afterwards was that as the news of this particular incident began to travel around the Emek, from Afula to Merhavia, from Merhavia to Kfar Yecheskel, from Kfar Yecheskel to Beit Shan, from Beit Shan to Beit Alpha, from Beit Alpha to Chepseva, and came back then to Afula, the size of my private parts had become enormous, alarming. And it took me after that months. It took me months to overcome the embarrassment. I noticed that people, some of the nurses and all sorts of people in Aful, started looking at me, examining me. And anyway, as I say, I have survived this incident, and shall we say, I am proud of the way that I was able to overcome the situation.
Thank you.